Uh-oh, it's time to talk some more about some of the social inventions coming from the white Americans. And one of those inventions was a people they called the N-word. And we already know what the N-word is. And so these so-called N-words were deliberately forced to occupy the lowest rung in society. And the concept of racial slavery was one of the tools used by the whites to ensure that they remained in that position, right? And so let's deal some more on this topic of race culture in 1800s America. And for us to do so, we're going to read from the book here. It's called Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley. So let's go on here on page 204, where the Grand Master writes this. The second reality, the creation and reification of race as a new form of social stratification with all its cultural integument, is somewhat more complex to delineate, yet is at the heart of this analysis. Race is not a biological reality. It's a reality that society has constructed, and it's one that has been continuously reinforced across generations as a primary form of identifying people in Western culture. And so race attempts to lump people into groups who share somewhat similar physical features, the physical features that had been singled out as a point of focus, right? That's what it's focused on. And these physical similarities or differences are what societal rulers took advantage of to create a stratified society, or more specifically, a society that ranks members from top to bottom based on the concept of race, with those lumped into the white category as the superior ones and those in the black group as the inferiors, right? And everyone else in between. And so this is part of race and what Dr. Smedley is dealing with in her analysis, right? Here we go. It involved the differentiation of blacks as distinct beings, a magnification of the social distance between blacks and whites, and the formulation in the white mind of a stereotype that became a caricature known as the Nigg. She's referring to the reification of race, which she talked about in the earlier sentence, or the process of taking the abstract idea of race and treating it as if it were an actual concrete reality. And so, in other words, the society took many of the exaggerated ideas they had about blacks in their imagination, and they contrasted those with ideas they had about whites to create this vast perceived difference between the two groups, right? The polarity, the white and black thing, right? And this had actual consequences in the physical real world. And they made it seem as if the whites were the standard of humanity up here, while on the other extreme, there existed this other thing called the N-word, right? Let's get some more. We have seen that the dichotomy between slaves and free men had become established in the American mind as concomitant with physical differences. The dichotomy, or the contrast between the slave and the free people, became concomitant or linked together with physical differences. So various shades of deep brown skin, which they called black, was associated with the slave, and the various light hues, which they called white, were associated with freedom. And so this is the association of ideas. Pay attention and let's keep going. It is based on this fact that Davis concluded,
in no ancient society was the distinction between slave and freeman sharply drawn as in America.
All ancient civilizations indulged in slavery, but theirs was like a 1.0 up to a 4.0 version of slavery. None of them brought it up to the 9.0 version like the English colonizers and their later white descendants did. Here we go. White Americans had come to express this distinction by defining blacks as a race apart and ranking them as the lowest of all groups in a racial scale of being. Pay attention. The white Americans were defining the blacks. The people called black didn't pick their name. They didn't pick the group they belonged to. They didn't define most of their own reputation, and they didn't consent to participating in the race game in the beginning, right? All of this was handed to them in America by the English and the white Americans. And playing by their rules, they defined and ranked the blacks as the lowest in the racial scale of being, right? Let's get some more. Once reified, that is, crystallized and rendered as substantive reality, the folk idea of race assumed an identity and autonomy of its own, aided by the authority of learned opinion. That means these racial ideas, rankings, and folk ideas about people, which mostly began in the world of imagination, manifested in the world of reality and took on a life of their own. And the scientists, preachers, Politicians, scholars pumped fuel into this fire, so to get it to burneth hotter than a coal, right? This is what the Grand Master's talking about. The autonomy of any aspect of culture is, of course, relative, but ideas and ideologies, when institutionalized in people's minds, often develop a fluidity and refractivity that allow them to persist even in drastically altered situations. That means once the idea becomes rooted in people's consciousness, it pivots and adapts to remain alive. Do you remember we talked about it taking on a life of its own? Well, the idea wants to survive and it needs a house to dwell in. And where is that house located? Inside of the human mind, right? And just like humans and other animals do whatever is necessary to survive, these deeply rooted ideas do the same exact thing, and they try to pivot and survive and adapt even when the circumstances change, right? They're essentially living entities after their own kind, and they become part of the human and part of the human's being, right? And what the earth is to the human mind is to those ideas, right? Understand? And let's keep reading. In this case, the amorphous nature of race meant that the ideology could transcend the sources of its origin, and race classifications could be logically extended to any populations where inequality and a sense of unbridgeable differences were desirable. This means that since race as a concept was not clearly fixed or defined, that it could evolve beyond what it was originally conceived to be, which is exactly what it did. And the racial trap could be used on people and other groups in other societies who wanted to keep certain people locked down into a pit. And it became a political system and a tool for dominating others, primarily by those who labeled themselves as white, right? Other people used it too, but primarily the whites, who went around to various parts of the world putting the system in place. And why did they do that? Because it worketh very well for the intended purpose, right? Now let's keep reading. Such populations could be identified by color or other physical features, and their relative ranks be established accordingly. And we already know who goes where in the rankings. Now, I remember when I went to Panama City, I believe it was in 2017. When I got there, one of the first things I noticed was that the people with the brown hue, they lived primarily in the projects and in the slums. And I made sure that my guide Augusto took me to those parts so I can see the living in those areas for myself, right? And just across the water, right, which is not that far, in the high rises and the other nicer parts of the city, that's where many of the people with the lighter complexions lived, right? And it was shocking to me to see how color-coded the city was and how it was set up in such a manner, right? I thought it was just an American thing that was set up this way, but that was not the case, right? And it made me realize just how serious the whites were when it came to playing this game, and how this was not just an American thing. This was something that they took in to many places of the world and multiplied that system and put it in place in different areas, right? So it was a shocker to me, right? And it was quite apparent, right, when you go there to see it, right? It was no mistake about it. And so this just reminds me, this sentence reminds me of that experience. Here we go, though. In the 19th century, relationships between whites and Native Americans were changing dramatically, as white dominance crippled the ability of Indians to resist their cultural encroachment. Views about the Indians also shifted as what some historians have called romantic racialism replaced images of bestiality and savagery, and blacks became the new savages. Now, why did the blacks become the new savages? Because this was part of creating the justification for slavery. So the idea was to destroy their character and their reputation as much as possible so they could be fully dehumanized in the public eye. This desensitization reduced any objections to slavery and allowed the system to continue profiting without much moral challenges, right? And this is one of the reasons they became the new savages. Indians were ranked higher than blacks in the ordering system. And who created the rankings? The whites. Do you think the blacks volunteered themselves to be the lowest in the social order? Of course not, right? The white elites controlled who ranked where in the system they controlled. Asians, when the need arose later, were variously located, depending on who was constructing the gradations, either between whites and Indians or between Indians and blacks. In the eyes of its formulators, the ranking was based on each group's presumed capacity for civilization. So since the blacks were at the bottom, Dr. Smedley is implying that the whites used that to represent them as being the least capable of developing a civilization. And what is a civilization? It's a complex society that includes order and structure, and it has a social structure, advanced culture, a government, an economy. It has laws and regulations, technology. It has a religious, spiritual, or philosophical institution, and so forth, right? And they ranked blacks at the very bottom, which is to say that they were least capable of doing this. Now, here we go. There is no doubt that, whatever the strength of their attitudes toward human variation, the originators of race perceived it as a mechanism of social stratification. They argued from a simple logic. Someone had to be the mudsill to do the mean, dirty, dangerous, and difficult work in civilized society. That's the slave, or the person who was stuck doing all of the physical, back-breaking manual work, right? The mudsill of society. These were the people who worked primarily from the shoulders down, right? Here we go. And others had to be the leaders, thinkers, planners, creators, and administrators of high culture. Those are the people who work primarily from the mouth and mind. Their labor takes place primarily from the shoulders up, right? And remember one thing, that the prevailing argument at that time was that the blacks were considered unfit for intellectual pursuits, which reinforced the racial rankings which appeared to be correct to them at that time. Let's keep going. The use of original physical differences to structure such social ranks, for those who had the power to do so, was perhaps a logical consequence of the conquest situation and the enslavement of physically differing populations. All right, so we're going to stop right here and we're going to pick up from this point in the next video. Now, in this video, we discussed race as an idea that's constructed in the mind first and then acted out in the physical world as a consequence of the belief of that idea, right? And the good doctor also dealt with the adaptability of racial ideas and its use for maintaining differences in certain societies when there's a desired population that needs to be held down in the pit, right? And how it's used as a tool to do so. And we also heard about the N-word replacing the Indian as the new savage. Now, in the next video, we're going to deal with the race culture in the 1800s South and the North, and how the free Negro was socially tormented by those puffing on white supremacy. So you're going to want to stay tuned for that. But right now, what I want to do is thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.